"You can't bring that through here," Cynthia Bellamy, president of our HOA board, said flatly, her manicured hand resting on the iron gate lever like she owned the ground beneath it. She didn't lower her voice, didn't glance at the hearse idling behind me. My wife's coffin sat inside, its polished wood catching a cruel glint from the late afternoon sun. Cynthia's smile was practiced, sharp, smug, and final. "The board hasn't approved this procession." I stared at her for a beat, the words catching in my throat. This wasn't some lawn sign she was pulling, or a paint color dispute. She was blocking my wife's funeral. I leaned forward, my voice low enough to cut. "This gate? I designed the security firmware. Every alert still pings back to me. Don't test me, Cynthia." And that's when she blinked, just for a second. That tiny shift, the smugness cracking, was the only thing that kept me steady. If she could stop a coffin once, she could stop anyone, anytime. That's why you should hit subscribe now. Because this fight, it didn't stay private, it went public, and it set fire to the board's power. I took a breath and straightened, letting the silence stretch. "My name's Daniel Mercer. I'm a systems engineer. I built half the infrastructure this neighborhood runs on. Sensors, alarms, even the smart irrigation. And I'm not asking you permission to bury my wife, I'm telling you." My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Calm has its own weight. The truth was, none of this was about convenience. The gate wasn't just metal. It was the line between dignity and disgrace. My wife, Leah, spent her last days asking me for one thing: to be buried under the oak tree that overlooked the lake, the one we used to sit beneath during summer storms. That oak was more than wood and leaves. It was where she told me she wanted our daughter to learn how to ride a bike, where she told me she wasn't afraid of dying, as long as she'd rest close to home. And now Cynthia Bellamy wanted to make her point on the very day Leah's coffin needed to pass through. The hum of the hearse engine behind me became unbearable, like it was holding its breath. I could feel the weight of the neighborhood watching, curtains shifting, phones in hands. My daughter's quiet sob in the back seat seared through me. Cynthia tilted her head, lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Board rules exist for a reason, Mr. Mercer. If we allow one exception, chaos follows." I didn't answer her right away. Instead, I glanced at the security camera mounted above the gate, the same one I'd installed 5 years earlier, back when they'd begged me to upgrade the system after a break-in. My system, my work. Every frame would record what Cynthia was doing, and I'd make sure the world saw it if I had to. She thought grief made me weak. She thought rules gave her absolute control. She didn't see that my grief was a blade, sharpened by every hour Leah lay in that coffin, waiting for the dignity she'd been promised. "Where are you watching from?" Because from where I stood, pressed between iron bars and unyielding arrogance, I wasn't just fighting to honor Leah. I was fighting for every neighbor too afraid to speak up. And for the first time since she passed, I felt a flicker of fire. Cynthia Bellamy might have held the gate, but she hadn't seen me open doors before. The flicker of fire inside me didn't fade as the gate clanged shut behind us. Cynthia eventually relented, not out of compassion, but because the stairs from the houses around the cul-de-sac made it impossible for her to hold her ground without risking immediate backlash. The hearse rolled through, slow and deliberate. Every turn of its wheels, a reminder that Leah's dignity had been put on trial by a woman more concerned with bylaws than with human grief. When the service ended beneath the oak tree, silence carried heavier than the prayers. Neighbors lingered at the edges of the grass, not to comfort me, but to watch. Their faces said what their mouths didn't. They'd all been waiting for someone else to break first. Cynthia's rulebook had touched every home here, shed doors repainted, gardens trimmed to the inch, even toys banned from porches if they didn't fit the board's aesthetic. But blocking a coffin? That struck deeper. Later that evening, I drove to the community hall for the board's special meeting. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale wash over the beige walls and framed maps of parcel lines. Cynthia sat at the long table in the center, flanked by the rest of her board, 5 people who nodded when she nodded and frowned when she frowned. Their chairs faced rows of folding seats where residents shuffled in, whispering, every seat filled. For once, the HOA's business had an audience. Cynthia cleared her throat and tapped the microphone. "Tonight's session addresses the unauthorized procession through controlled property," she began, as though she hadn't stared at a coffin hours earlier. Her tone was precise, legalistic, every word designed to sound inevitable. The board reminds residents that all access must be approved in advance. Exceptions undermine the order we work so hard to maintain. The murmurs grew sharper. A man in the back muttered, "Order, my ass!" Another woman shook her head, crossing her arms. I stayed standing, not waiting for recognition, not waiting for her to finish her script. "Call it what you want," I said, my voice cutting over hers. "You tried to stop my wife from being buried in her own neighborhood. That's not order, that's abuse." Her eyes narrowed. "Mr. Mercer, this is not the time." "It's exactly the time," I said, stepping closer to the table. My pulse pounded, but I kept my voice steady. "This isn't just about me. It's about every one of us who's been fined, threatened, or humiliated. You think no one notices? They notice. They're here tonight because they're tired of watching you stretch rules to cover your power grabs." The crowd stirred, whispers turning into nods. Cynthia's lips thinned, but she didn't stop me. She couldn't. Not with every set of eyes on her. Not with the hum of 100 phones recording. I scanned the room and saw him, Mark Ellison, the board's treasurer. He sat rigid, hands folded tight, sweat on his forehead. His gaze flicked from me to Cynthia, then down to the papers in front of him. He looked like a man torn between loyalty and conscience. For a moment, our eyes locked, and something passed between us. Hesitation, guilt, maybe even regret. He was the first crack in her wall. Cynthia reached for her gavel. "The board will deliberate in private session," she announced quickly, striking wood against wood. But the sound didn't silence the room. It only fueled the tension. I left before she could clear the hall. Outside, the cool air hit me like a jolt. Porch lights flicked on up and down the street, neighbors spilling out in small knots. Some clapped my shoulder as I passed. Others just nodded, their eyes saying what they were too afraid to voice aloud, that maybe someone finally had the spine to stand against her. What Cynthia didn't realize was that every censor in this community, every system she relied on to enforce her control, was my design. And while she sat in that sterile hall clutching her gavel, I knew something she didn't. The data those systems recorded wasn't hers to control. It was mine. And soon, it would tell a story she couldn't bury. I walked back toward my house with the night pressing heavy on my shoulders, but my thoughts weren't on Cynthia anymore. They were on the man who couldn't look me in the eye for more than a second. Mark Ellison, the treasurer of the HOA board. His silence in that hall had been louder than anything Cynthia had barked into her microphone. I knew hesitation when I saw it. I'd spent a career reading signals in code, tracing errors through patterns. Mark's body language told me there was a fault line under Cynthia's control, and it was ready to split. The next morning, I stopped by the community fitness center, a glass-fronted building the board had renovated last year with mandatory fees. It was one of Cynthia's trophies. She bragged about its security, its smart access, its pristine order. I knew better. I'd designed the card readers on the doors, and I knew exactly how often they failed. But I wasn't there to test the system. I was there because I knew Mark went for a run every morning at 6, pounding out miles on the treadmill like he was chasing something he could never catch. When I walked in, the place smelled of disinfectant and rubber mats. Music thumped low from ceiling speakers, but the room was nearly empty. Just one man, sweat darkening his shirt, eyes fixed on the digital display in front of him. His stride was heavy, his jaw clenched. Mark Ellison looked less like a man exercising and more like a man punishing himself. I didn't interrupt right away. I watched as he slowed, his chest heaving, sweat dripping from his chin. He leaned on the treadmill bars, staring at nothing. His shoulders shook, not from exertion, but from something heavier. Guilt has a weight all its own, and it draped across him like a wet coat. Finally, he noticed me. His eyes darted, quick and defensive, then dropped to the floor. His hands fumbled with the towel at his side, twisting it, wringing it, like he could strangle whatever truth was clawing inside him. When he tried to speak, his lips pressed shut, the words retreating. His silence told me more than anything he could have said. I stepped closer. He tensed, shifting his weight from foot to foot, tapping the treadmill console as if pretending to still be busy. But his chest was still rising too fast, and his fingers drummed a nervous rhythm against the plastic. I'd seen that rhythm before in malfunctioning systems. A loop, a signal that something beneath the surface was breaking. "Cynthia's not invincible," I said quietly, keeping my voice low so it didn't carry. His eyes flicked up, just for a second, then away again. His throat worked as he swallowed hard, but he said nothing. That was enough. His silence wasn't loyalty, it was fear, and fear could be redirected. The fitness center door banged open behind me, and another resident walked in, giving us a casual nod before heading to the weight racks. Mark immediately grabbed his water bottle and turned away, wiping at his face with his towel as if I wasn't there. But his back betrayed him, his shoulders hunched, his head dipped, his steps uneven. He wasn't dismissing me, he was retreating, hiding from his own conscience. I left him there, but not without certainty. Mark Ellison was cracking, and when he finally broke, Cynthia's empire would lose more than a treasurer. It would lose its shield of silent consent. Walking back through the manicured paths of the neighborhood, I felt the weight of eyes again. Neighbors behind blinds, behind neat hedges, behind enforced perfection. They'd seen the coffin stopped. They'd seen the confrontation in the hall. And now they were waiting to see if someone on the inside of the board would finally have the courage to stand up. That oak tree by the lake came into view as I turned down my street. Its branches swayed gently, leaves scattering in the wind. Leah's grave was fresh, the soil still dark. I paused, hands tightening into fists. Cynthia thought she could twist rules into chains, but what she didn't understand was that I wasn't alone anymore. Even if Mark hadn't spoken, his trembling hands and averted eyes had already chosen sides. He just didn't know it yet. The oak's branches swayed above Leah's grave, and I stood there longer than I meant to, the silence wrapping around me like armor. But Cynthia wasn't done. I knew that before my phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from the HOA board email list lit up the screen. Notice of violation, unauthorized funeral gathering, fine, $12,500. I almost laughed. Almost. But the rage cut through faster. She'd turned grief into a line item, stamping a dollar figure on the very act of burying my wife. It wasn't about money. It was about control, her favorite weapon. I didn't stay by the oak. I drove straight to my office downtown, a converted loft where I kept my servers running. From the outside, it looked like any other tech workspace. Brick walls, wide windows, cluttered desks. But for me, it was a war room. Every project I'd built, every system I'd ever installed in this community, pulsed through the racks of blinking lights against the far wall. Cynthia might have thought she controlled the neighborhood, but the heartbeat of that control lived here, and I held the keys. As I logged in, the streams of data lit up the monitors, gate access logs, security camera feeds, irrigation patterns, all of it tied together by the firmware I'd written years ago. Cynthia used these systems to issue fines and enforce compliance, but the irony was inescapable. She couldn't wield her power without leaning on mine. I leaned back, letting the monitors flicker across my glasses. Cynthia had escalated just like I expected. A violation notice was her way of declaring war, and she'd made her mistake public. The notice was sent to every homeowner's inbox, not just mine. Every neighbor now knew she'd fined a grieving widower for honoring his wife's burial request. That wasn't just cruelty, that was evidence. But evidence alone wouldn't topple her. I needed leverage, and leverage meant timing. I thought of Mark again, his trembling hands on that treadmill, the way his shoulders had folded in on themselves. He knew something he couldn't say in the open. If I could line up his guilt with the data I controlled, Cynthia's iron grip would start to slip. The servers hummed around me as I pulled up the community-wide access reports. I scanned through timestamps from the day of the funeral. Cynthia had logged gate overrides 3 separate times that afternoon, first to deny the hearse entry, then to lock the gate after being forced to relent, and finally to access the community hall before the meeting. Each override carried her credentials, her electronic signature. She hadn't just abused power socially, she'd left a digital fingerprint of her obstruction. The law was clear. HOA boards could enforce guidelines, but blocking access to essential services, especially emergency or funeral-related, crossed into territory that state courts had ruled against time and again. She'd stepped outside her authority, and she'd done it on a platform I had designed to record everything. I saved the files, backing them onto secure drives, each one encrypted and mirrored. This wasn't about waving them in her face yet. This was about building something undeniable. Cynthia could deny an accusation. She couldn't deny the system logs, the footage, the automatic pings. And when the time came, I'd make sure not just the board saw them, but the entire community. The office lights flickered as evening settled in. I shut down the displays and sat in the quiet, my hands pressed flat against the desk. Cynthia thought the $2,500 notice would humiliate me, would force me into compliance or silence. Instead, it gave me the perfect justification to dig deeper, to set my plan in motion. For years, neighbors had whispered about her pettiness, her iron rules, her fines. But whispers weren't enough. Proof was. And for the first time since Leah's coffin had been stopped at that gate, I knew exactly where this fight was headed. Cynthia had weaponized my own systems against me. Now those same systems would become the evidence that undid her. I left the office that night with the backup drives tucked under my arm, the glow of the servers still burning in my head. Proof alone wasn't enough. I needed to understand exactly how far Cynthia had pushed her authority, and how much of it the board had allowed. To find that out, I had to step into their territory, not as a target, but as an observer. The next morning, I walked into the neighborhood cafe, the only public space within the gates not directly run by the board. It smelled of burnt espresso and fresh muffins, a quiet corner where residents came to vent in whispers, hoping no board member would overhear. The cafe had become the unofficial pressure valve of the community, a place where complaints flowed easier than coffee. I ordered black coffee and slid into a booth by the window. From here, I could see everyone who came and went. And sure enough, Cynthia's lieutenants arrived one by one. Not Cynthia herself. She preferred to pull strings from her pristine home office. But the others. 2 board members sat near the counter, papers spread out, their voices low but urgent. And then came Mark Ellison, treasurer, his shoulders already slumped, his gaze darting around the room like a man who expected to be caught. I didn't approach him. Not yet. Instead, I listened. The cafe was small, voices carried, and I didn't need to strain. One of the board members hissed, "The fine was necessary. We can't afford to show weakness." The other muttered back, "Necessary? People are furious. Blocking a funeral? That's not enforcement. That's suicide." Mark didn't join their argument. He sat apart, staring into his coffee, stirring it so long the spoon clinked against porcelain in uneven beats. His lips pressed tight, his jaw flexing. The picture of a man who wanted to speak but couldn't. When one of them asked him about the budget line for fines, he flinched before answering. "It's manageable," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "as long as no one challenges it." That was the slip I needed, as long as no one challenges it. The words hung in the air, and even he seemed to regret saying them. His fingers tightened around the spoon, metal scraping louder, harsher, as though he was punishing himself for letting anything out. His eyes flicked up, caught mine across the room, and for a heartbeat, he froze. Then he looked down again, shoulders folding further, as if he wished the floor would swallow him whole. I left my booth and walked to the counter, not to confront him directly, but to make my presence undeniable. As I passed, I saw his hands tremble against the cup. His nails dug into the ceramic, and his breathing hitched. He wasn't Cynthia, reveling in the fight. He was a man unraveling in slow motion, torn between his role and his conscience. I took my coffee and stepped outside. The sunlight was sharp, bouncing off the cafe's glass front, and I leaned against the brick wall, sipping slow. Through the window, Mark sat rigid, staring at the space I had left behind. He wanted to talk. He just didn't know how. That hesitation was confirmation. He wasn't my enemy, not really. He was the witness I needed, the insider who could validate everything the system logs already showed. But pushing him too soon would only drive him back under Cynthia's shadow. He had to reach the breaking point on his own. I turned toward the manicured boulevard, the HOA's pride, lined with identical hedges and spotless sidewalks. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Cynthia wanted everything uniform, controlled, without cracks. But cracks had a way of spreading, and Mark was one of them. That night, back at my loft office, I replayed the cafe scene in my head while the servers whirred. Mark's words echoed, "As long as no one challenges it." Challenge was coming, and I wasn't alone in carrying it anymore. His silence, his body language, his accidental confession, they were all part of the story the data would tell. Cynthia thought she'd buried me under fines and humiliation. What she didn't realize was that every move she made left a trail, and I was following it straight back to her. The data trail glowed across my monitors, each log a breadcrumb pointing to Cynthia's abuse of power. But proof locked in my office wasn't enough. If this fight was going to shift, I needed the community to feel it in real time, to see with their own eyes what the board had become. Waiting for the perfect moment wouldn't work. Cynthia controlled the calendar, the meetings, the narrative. I had to choose the battlefield myself. That's how I found myself at the neighborhood playground on Saturday afternoon. It wasn't my usual place. Leah used to bring our daughter here while I worked, sending me photos of her sliding down the bright blue chute, hair flying, cheeks pink. Now, it was just another space stamped with HOA rules. No chalk drawings, no toys left unattended, no gatherings without notice. The signs were nailed to every post like commandments. But the playground was also where families gathered without thinking, where gossip flowed while kids clambered over jungle gyms. If I wanted to shift opinion, this was where I had to plant the seed. I walked past the swings, laptop bag slung over my shoulder, and set up on a bench under the shade of the pavilion. A couple of neighbors glanced my way, curious, but no one stopped me. Not yet. I pulled out the small projector I kept for client demos, connected it to my laptop, and aimed it at the blank concrete wall beside the slide. The system logs flickered to life, lines of time-stamped entries scrolling like a heartbeat across stone. At first, no one paid attention, but then a father pushing his toddler on the swing slowed, squinting. A woman holding a coffee cup drifted closer, shading her eyes. Within minutes, a half circle of residents stood watching, kids pausing mid-play to tug at their parents' arms. "See this entry," I said, my voice steady but loud enough to carry. I pointed at the log marked Access Override, Gate Blocked, User, Bellamy, C. That was the moment Cynthia stopped the hearse carrying Leah's coffin. Not speculation, not rumor. The system recorded it. Gasps rippled through the group. A man muttered, "Jesus Christ." Another woman shook her head, arms wrapping around herself like she needed protection from the truth. And here, I continued scrolling, is when she locked the gate again, after being forced to let us through. Same credentials, same abuse of control. These aren't my words, they're the system's. The crowd grew denser, phones lifted, recording, screens glowing as people captured what I was showing. Cynthia's weapon of control had turned into my evidence, her fingerprints stamped on every line of code. In the back of the group, I spotted him, Mark Ellison. He wasn't front and center. He lingered by the edge of the pavilion, half hidden behind a support beam, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. But his eyes were locked on the projection, wide and unblinking. His posture screamed conflict. One foot angled toward the group, the other turned to leave, shoulders hunched as if he could fold himself out of existence. He didn't speak, but the tremor in his jaw told me he was reliving every board meeting, every vote, every moment he'd stayed silent. I shut down the projection before Cynthia's loyalists could scatter to warn her. The wall went blank, leaving the murmurs of neighbors to fill the air. Some nodded at me, lips tight. Others whispered furiously to each other. What mattered was that the story was no longer mine alone. It belonged to every person standing there. As people drifted off, pulling their kids along, Mark stayed rooted to his spot. He didn't approach, but he didn't leave either. His hands clenched and unclenched, his eyes darting from me to the ground. He looked like a man carrying a weight he couldn't set down. And I knew when the moment came, he'd have no choice but to let it fall. The playground emptied slowly, leaving me alone beneath the pavilion. I packed up the projector, heart still hammering. Cynthia thought her rules made her untouchable, but now the community had seen the truth etched into the very systems she relied on. And once truth takes root in public, control begins to slip. I left the playground with the projector tucked back in my bag, but I didn't feel victorious. The neighbors had seen the logs, had whispered and recorded, but whispers alone couldn't topple Cynthia. The board would scramble to spin it as taken out of context, or worse, claim I'd fabricated it. Proof mattered, but validation from inside the board, that was the missing piece. That night, I returned to the loft office, the hum of the servers louder than usual, like they knew I was waiting for something. I sat there replaying the images of Mark Ellison at the playground, half hidden in the shadows, his fists clenching and unclenching. He was breaking, I could see it. The question was whether he'd fall toward me or retreat back to Cynthia's leash. The answer came the next evening. I found a folded note slipped under my front door, the paper plain, the handwriting hurried. Meet me at the maintenance shed by the tennis courts. Midnight, don't tell anyone. No signature, but I didn't need one. I went. The tennis courts sat on the far side of the community, lights dark, nets sagging. The maintenance shed squatted just beyond the fence, paint peeling, padlock rusted. I leaned against the wall, waiting, the night air cool against my skin. Minutes later, footsteps crunched on the gravel path. Mark emerged from the shadows, head swiveling as if every tree might hold a camera. He wore a hoodie, the hood pulled low, but I recognized the hunched shoulders, the tension coiled in his frame. When he reached me, he didn't speak at first. He just pressed his back against the shed, eyes darting, breath shallow. Finally, he whispered, "I can't keep covering for her." The words spilled like water from a cracked pipe. His hands shook as he tugged at the hem of his hoodie, twisting the fabric. "Cynthia, she doesn't just stretch rules, she rewrites them. That fine she hit you with? It wasn't approved by the board. She sends them out on her own, then forces us to sign off later. Half the time we don't even see the violations she cites. She locks records away in her personal files, keeps the financials hidden. I'm the treasurer, Daniel. I'm supposed to know where every dollar goes, but I don't. She won't let me." I stayed silent, letting him keep talking. The flood had only just begun. "She says it's to keep order, but it's about control. Those security systems you built, she uses them like a surveillance grid, tracking which residents leave lights on. Past curfew, which kids sneak onto the playground after hours. She finds them all, and no one questions it because they think the logs are ironclad. But I know better now. She alters them before anyone else can see. That's why she's so smug. She thinks she owns the data." His laugh was bitter, sharp. "But you built the system. She doesn't realize the originals don't belong to her." His shoulders slumped as the weight came off, but the guilt stayed in his eyes. "I should have spoken up earlier. The day of Leah's funeral, I wanted to. I wanted to stand up in that hall and call it what it was. But I froze. I've been freezing for years." I stepped closer, the gravel crunching under my shoes. "You're not frozen now." His jaw worked, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. "If I give you the financial trail, the hidden accounts, the off-the-record fines, you can prove it. Not just to the neighbors, but to the state. They'll have to investigate. It won't just be your word against hers anymore." He reached into his hoodie and pulled out a small USB drive, pressing it into my hand. His fingers lingered for a second, trembling, before pulling back. "Be careful," he whispered. "If she finds out I gave you this, she'll bury me. Maybe not literally, but close enough." I closed my fist around the drive, the weight of it solid, real. For the first time since Leah's coffin had been stopped at that gate, I felt the tide shifting. Cynthia had her rules, her fines, her arrogance. But now I had something she couldn't manipulate, a confession from inside her own circle, and the evidence to prove it. The USB drive felt heavier than steel as I walked back from the tennis courts. Mark's words replayed with every step. Hidden accounts, altered records, fines invented from thin air. Cynthia hadn't just abused her authority. She'd turned the HOA into her personal kingdom, feeding off fear and silence. Now I held the one thing she couldn't dismiss, proof from the inside. I didn't go home. I drove straight to the university library downtown, a place where I knew I could work undisturbed. Its tall stone columns and quiet, echoing halls had been a refuge when I was a student, and tonight they became a war room. The rows of computers hummed, the scent of old books grounding me in something timeless, bigger than HOA bylaws and fabricated fines. In a corner study carrel, I plugged in the drive. Folders blinked open across the screen, spreadsheets, scanned invoices, unsigned violation forms. Dozens of them. Mark hadn't exaggerated. There were fines never approved by the board, maintenance fees with no receipts, and transfers into accounts I didn't recognize. Each file carried dates, signatures, or sometimes nothing at all. And hidden among them were notes in Cynthia's handwriting, scanned PDFs where she scrawled, "Push this through quietly," or "Delay disclosure." Every line told the same story. A woman who believed rules were hers to twist, residents hers to tax, silence hers to enforce. I leaned back, hands pressed against my face, anger mixed with something sharper. Resolve. Cynthia had tried to humiliate me at my lowest point, but this wasn't just about me anymore. Every neighbor who'd paid a mysterious fine, every parent who'd been threatened over a child's chalk drawing, every widow who'd wondered if she'd be next. This evidence belonged to them too. Still, dumping it all at once would be reckless. Cynthia thrived on intimidation, and she'd claim taken out of context before most people could scroll past the first page. I needed precision, strategy, the same way I'd debug a system. Identify the critical fault, trace it, then expose it where failure couldn't be denied. I started mapping connections, cross-referencing the data on the USB with the raw system logs from my own servers. Side by side, the story became undeniable. Cynthia blocked the gate at Leah's funeral, fined me without board approval, and siphoned funds while rewriting logs to cover her tracks. The digital evidence was airtight, and Mark's files sealed it. But exposure wasn't just about proof, it was about audience. I couldn't count on the HOA's internal mechanisms. Cynthia controlled those, stacking the board with loyalists too scared to oppose her. No, the fight had to move outside her walls. Local news, state housing regulators, even the city inspector's office, places where her voice wouldn't be the loudest. I printed a few pages of the most damning records and slipped them into a folder. Physical proof, harder to hack, impossible to delete. The smell of toner hung in the air as the printer spat out pages marked with her handwriting, her overrides, her commands. When I left the library, the night air was cool and sharp, a reminder that the world outside Cynthia's fences still moved freely. The folder under my arm wasn't just paperwork, it was leverage, the kind that could rip her grip from this community's throat. On the drive back, headlights swept across quiet streets. I passed houses with porch lights glowing, families eating late dinners, children's toys scattered in yards, all the lives she'd controlled from behind her gatehouse rules. They didn't know it yet, but soon they'd see her. Empire was hollow. I parked in front of my house and sat in the dark car for a long minute. Leah's absence weighed heavy, the silence inside the home pressing against me. But for the first time since the funeral, I felt like I was keeping my promise, that she'd leave this world with dignity, and that no one would strip her memory down to a violation notice. Cynthia Bellamy had written her own downfall into the very systems she used to dominate. And now, with Mark's confession and the evidence in my hands, I was ready to write the next chapter, the one where her power unraveled in front of everyone. I carried the folder into my house like it was an explosive, careful not to bend the edges, careful not to drop it. The evidence had weight now, physical, undeniable, ready to pierce through Cynthia's web of control. But raw documents weren't enough. If I wanted this fight to land, I had to set the stage where she couldn't wriggle out, where silence wouldn't protect her. The place came to me the next morning. The community church sat just outside the HOA's reach, a low brick building with stained glass that caught the sunrise and scattered it across the pews. It was neutral ground, a gathering place that Cynthia couldn't police with fines or bylaws. And every Sunday, the place filled with the very people she lorded over. If truth was going to spread, it had to start here. I arrived early before the service, slipping into one of the side rooms where volunteers set out hymnals and brewed coffee. The smell of burnt grounds clung to the air. I asked the pastor for 5 minutes after the service, just 5 minutes to speak. He looked at me with a mix of concern and compassion, then nodded. If it needs saying, it needs saying. As the service ended and families filed into the fellowship hall for coffee and chatter, I set the projector on a folding table, the same one I'd used at the playground, but this time the wall behind me carried a wooden cross. Neighbors gathered slowly, curious, their voices low. Some gave me nods of encouragement, others wary glances. Cynthia's shadow still stretched long, even here. I opened with the logs, her digital fingerprints on the gate the day of Leah's funeral. Murmurs rose immediately, sharper this time, angrier. Then I slid the folder open and held up a page. Cynthia's handwriting sprawled across the margins. Push this through quietly. This isn't about rules, I said, my voice carrying across the room. It's about control. She's been inventing fines, hiding money, and rewriting records to cover her tracks. This community isn't her kingdom. It belongs to all of us. Phones lifted again, flashes of cameras, the red dots of recording lights blinking. But this time, something shifted. The murmurs didn't stay whispers. They grew into a low rumble of outrage. And then, through the crowd, I saw him, Mark Ellison. He hadn't stayed on the sidelines. He stood just inside the doorway, pale but steady, his eyes fixed on the folder in my hand. When I motioned him forward, he hesitated, shoulders curling in. But then he stepped out, each pace dragging courage from somewhere deep. He cleared his throat, and though his voice trembled, his words hit like a hammer. "It's true, all of it. Cynthia keeps the financials locked from the rest of us. She issues fines without approval. I'm the treasurer, and I've been forced to sign off on numbers I've never seen explained. I stayed quiet because I was afraid of losing my home, my job, my standing. But after what she did at Leah's funeral," his eyes flicked to me, then back to the crowd. I couldn't stay quiet anymore. The hall erupted. Some gasped, some shouted. A woman near the front shook her head, muttering, "I knew it." Another man called out, "She's finished." The rumble swelled into something stronger, momentum. Mark's hands shook at his sides, but he didn't run this time. He stood there, exposed, his confession hanging in the air. For years, Cynthia had relied on silence to keep her empire intact. And now, one of her own had broken it. I closed the folder, the wood of the table groaning beneath my palm. The next board meeting won't be business as usual. This evidence will be there. The confession will be there. And so will every one of you who's been waiting to be heard. She can't hide behind bylaws when the truth is this loud. The crowd surged, voices rising, not whispers now, but open defiance. It wasn't victory yet, but it was a fracture Cynthia couldn't mend. And once a crack splits wide enough, even the strongest facade falls. The rumble of voices in the church fellowship hall followed me out into the sunlight. For the first time since Leah's coffin had been blocked at the gate, I didn't feel alone in the fight. The community had heard the truth, and Mark's confession had torn open the silence Cynthia thrived on. But outrage in a church basement wasn't enough. If Cynthia was going to fall, it had to happen where she built her throne, in the board's chambers, under the fluorescent lights she controlled like stage lamps. 2 days later, the HOA board announced an emergency session at the Community Recreation Center. The email was terse, dripping with Cynthia's clipped authority. Attendance mandatory for residents. Unauthorized demonstrations will not be tolerated. She thought she could still dictate the terms, still scare people into their seats. But this time, people weren't coming to listen. They were coming to confront. When I arrived, the parking lot overflowed with cars. Neighbors who hadn't attended a meeting in years filed toward the glass doors in clusters, their voices sharp with anger and anticipation. Inside, the gymnasium had been converted into a makeshift hall, rows of folding chairs facing the long table, where Cynthia sat with her loyalists lined like soldiers at parade rest. She wore her usual pastel suit, hair sculpted to perfection, but her eyes betrayed the weight pressing down. I took a seat near the front, the folder of evidence resting on my lap. Mark slipped into a chair 2 rows back, his hood pulled low, but he was here. That mattered. His presence said more than words ever could. Cynthia tapped her gavel, the sound cracking through the air. This session has been called to address misinformation and slander circulating in the community. Certain individuals, her eyes flicked to me, have chosen to spread falsehoods, damaging the reputation of our association. This behavior cannot stand. The crowd muttered, shifting in their seats. Someone shouted, "You blocked a coffin." The words echoed off the gym walls like a gunshot. Cynthia's lips tightened, but she pressed on, voice icy. "We will review this matter in accordance with our bylaws. Order must be restored." That was my cue. I stood, folder in hand, and walked to the microphone set at the center aisle. The eyes of the room followed. My chest tightened, but my voice carried steady. "Order? You call it order when you block a grieving family from burying their dead? You call it order when you fine residents without approval, when you siphon money into accounts no one sees? That's not order, Cynthia. That's corruption." I laid the folder on the podium and opened it wide. Pages spilled across the surface. Logs, receipts, scanned notes in her handwriting. Phones lifted instantly, cameras zooming, flashes bursting as neighbors documented every page. Cynthia leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Those documents are stolen property." "They're board property," I cut in, meeting her glare. "And as treasurer, Mark Ellison has the right to share them. Isn't that right, Mark?" Every head turned. Mark froze in his chair, his hands twisting in his lap. For a moment, silence stretched too long. Then he stood, slow but deliberate, and stepped into the aisle. His voice shook, but the words landed. It's true. I gave him the files. Cynthia has been issuing fines without board consent. She hides records, manipulates the system logs. I've signed off on numbers I knew weren't clean because I was scared, but I'm not scared anymore. The gym erupted. Shouts, gasps, the scrape of chairs as people leaned forward. Cynthia's face flushed crimson, her composure cracking. She slammed the gavel, her voice rising. This meeting is out of order. Security, remove them. Two men in board-issued polos moved from the side wall, but they hesitated. The crowd had surged to its feet, voices overlapping, hands pointing at Cynthia. "Resign!" someone roared. "You're done." I gathered the papers back into the folder and held it high. The evidence will go to state regulators tomorrow. If you think you can silence me, think again. This isn't just my fight anymore. It's everyone's. And the world is watching. Cameras flashed again. Phones streamed live. Cynthia's empire wasn't just cracking, it was collapsing under the weight of her own arrogance. The gymnasium boiled over. The air was thick with voices, phones raised high, neighbors shouting over each other. Some yelled for Cynthia's resignation, others demanded answers, and the rest just recorded, their cameras catching every twitch of her face as her empire cracked. I stood at the microphone, the folder still in my hand, the evidence heavy as a verdict waiting to be delivered. Cynthia pounded her gavel again, the sound hollow, desperate. "Order! This is a legal assembly of the board. Sit down, or you will all be in violation." Her voice, usually sharp and commanding, strained under the roar of the crowd. For once, the gavel didn't silence anyone. It was just wood against wood, powerless against the storm she'd created. I raised my hand, and the noise dimmed just enough. "Every one of you here knows what happened the day of Leah's funeral. You saw the gate locked. You got the email about my so-called violation. And now you've seen the proof. Cynthia's overrides, Cynthia's hidden fines, Cynthia's forged authority. This isn't speculation. This is her own record betraying her." Cheers broke out, clapping, stomping on the gym floor until the bleachers rattled. Cynthia's loyalists on the board shifted uneasily in their seats, whispering furiously among themselves. One of them, a woman with glasses perched low on her nose, stood abruptly, looking straight at Cynthia. "You told us these were standard procedures," she said, her voice cutting across the hall. "But these documents show you've been making decisions without us." Cynthia's eyes widened, the mask slipping. "Sit down, Margaret," she snapped, her voice edged with panic. But it was too late. Margaret didn't sit. Neither did the other board members. They shifted away from her, some shaking their heads, others looking down at the table, as though ashamed to be caught in her shadow. The residents surged forward, closing the distance between the chairs and the board's long table. Phones hovered inches from Cynthia's face, recording every bead of sweat, every dart of her eyes. Someone shouted, "Say it on camera! Did you block that coffin or not?" Another voice roared, "What about the money, Cynthia? Where's our money?" Cynthia gripped the gavel so tightly her knuckles whitened. Her voice broke as she tried to push back. "These are lies, fabrications. You're all being manipulated by a man who... She gestured at me, but the words failed her. She knew what I was, an engineer, a widower, a man with nothing left to lose and the skills to prove her wrong. I stepped forward, holding up one of the printed logs for the cameras. "This isn't manipulation. This is your president's login denying access to a hearse. This is your president's signature authorizing unapproved fines. This is your president siphoning funds. Look at the timestamps. Look at the handwriting. No amount of shouting will erase it." The crowd roared again, louder, unified. Even the security staff, two men in board polos who'd been ordered to remove me, stood frozen, their arms crossed, watching instead of moving. They weren't about to drag out the one man standing between truth and her lies. Mark stepped into the aisle, his voice shaky but strong. "I was treasurer. I confirm every word. Cynthia has been hiding records, altering accounts, and lying to us all. I was complicit because I was afraid. But I'm done being afraid." His voice cracked, but the applause that followed swallowed his fear. Cynthia's chair scraped as she stood, her face a mask of fury and fear. "You'll regret this," she hissed, pointing a trembling finger at Mark, then at me. "Both of you. I built this community. You think you can tear me down? You'll see what happens when you cross me." But her threats bounced off the roar of the crowd. People shouted over her, drowning her words. "Resign! Apologize! "We want you out." It wasn't just noise, it was judgment. I stepped closer to the table, voice steady over the chaos. "This isn't your kingdom, Cynthia. It never was. And now the whole community sees it. No threats, no fines, no locked gates can hide the truth anymore." The cameras stayed fixed on her as she froze, caught in the spotlight of her own undoing. For the first time, Cynthia Bellamy looked small. The gymnasium didn't quiet until the cameras turned away from me and locked fully on Cynthia. She stood at the end of the long, folding table, her pastel jacket sharp against the dull gray walls, her face pale as every neighbor demanded the one thing she swore she would never give: an apology. The chant built slowly at first, one voice, then three, then the whole room rising in rhythm. "Apologize! Apologize!" The echo rattled the rafters, thunder from the very people she'd fined, threatened, and humiliated for years. For a moment, I thought she'd walk out. Her hand tightened around the gavel, her jaw clenched, and she took one step backward like a general about to retreat. But the wall of phones in her face trapped her. She could see it as clearly as I did. If she walked away, the videos would go viral anyway. If she stayed silent, the silence would convict her. The only move left was the one she despised most. Her voice cracked as she tried to regain control. This is a misunderstanding. Certain procedures—" "Say it!" someone shouted from the crowd. "Apologize for the coffin." Her lips trembled, the words catching in her throat. She looked at me, then at Mark, then at the cameras. The fight drained out of her shoulders, and her grip on the gavel loosened. Finally, with the weight of the entire neighborhood pressing down, she spoke. "I'm sorry," she said, the words brittle, forced through clenched teeth. "I should not have stopped the procession." The gym erupted, not in jeers this time, but in cheers. People clapped, whistled, hugged each other. Some cried. They weren't celebrating Cynthia's words. They were celebrating that her reign had broken, that the board president who thought herself untouchable had been forced to bend in front of them all. Mark exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging as though a burden had finally slipped free. He caught my eye across the aisle, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't look like a man trapped. He looked like someone who had chosen his side, no longer hiding in the margins. Cynthia tried to gather herself, but it was over. Regulators would come for the finances. Neighbors would demand elections. Her apology was the first domino in a chain she couldn't stop. She sat heavily in her chair, eyes glazed, no longer the ruler of anything. I closed the folder of evidence and stepped back from the microphone. The crowd was already speaking for itself now. Voices of residents sharing stories, trading numbers, planning the future without her shadow. The control Cynthia once held through fear had flipped into something stronger: solidarity. When I stepped outside into the cool night, the gym lights glowing behind me, I paused and looked back. For the first time since Leah's coffin was stopped at that gate, I felt I'd kept my promise. She had wanted dignity, a resting place under the oak tree, and now she had more than that. She had vindication. No one could erase the truth of what had happened, and no one would ever again try to deny her the respect she deserved. The neighborhood wasn't healed yet, but the healing had begun, and it started with one coffin, one gate, and one man refusing to bow to power. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now. Share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from.